Time travel. It's a confusing thing. Doesn't often make a whole lot of sense. Well, to be honest, it never does make a whole lot of sense. But nonetheless, it's a trope, a plot device that has been around for years, decades possibly, over a century at this point maybe. I don't know, I'm not that old. Whether it be the central point of a standalone book or the main plot point in the film that is the climax of 12 years of hard work, Avengers Endgame, yeah. My point is, time travel, whilst it is so often used in books, films, games, all sorts of entertainment media, it really doesn't have a solid definition. There are so many different ways that time travel has been interpreted over the years, so many different ways to do it, to incorporate it into your story. Perhaps if you travel back into the past, it will cause several spiraling timelines going on in different directions, calling into effect a whole multiverse. Or maybe back into the past doesn't create more timelines, but just changes what happens in yours. That's the more traditional, or simplified rather, version of time travel, the age old tale of a time traveler moving a single chair, going back to the present, and finding the world has been overridden by robots and AI. We've all seen that one before. Or you can do it as Harry Potter does time travel in The Prisoner of Azkaban, in the most confusing way possible. Yeah, you're gonna want to concentrate for this one. Although, surprise, surprise, I have never really been a hater of the way Harry Potter did time travel, unlike quite a lot of people out there. In fact, it actually is my favourite interpretation of time travel, believe it or not, even if it is quite a bit confusing. The reason for that is, after thinking about it for a while and maybe trying to write it down to make more sense of it, it did just make sense. An actual example from The Prisoner of Azkaban is, if you go back in time and chucked a blueberry at the back of someone's head, that person in real time would feel that blueberry hit the back of their head. That's Harry Potter time travel on the surface in its most basic form. It's not a spiraling timeline with multiple branches, whatever that is, but it's one timeline. It's the same principle with this. If you go back in time right now and warned your past self that he would have to go back in time in exactly 1 year to deliver this same message, then that past self, present you from a year ago, would remember that message, and 1 year later would go back in time to remind the other past one, who himself would do that a year later, and the cycle continues, possibly until the end of time. Following? No, I'm not either. Just to clarify, by the way, Harry Potter and the Cursed Child does actually delve into time travel, but we're not really going to be talking about that today or using any examples from the Cursed Child, since I don't really think it bears any relevance to the main story, and as a lot of you say, it's utter shit anyways. Okay, so I found a Reddit post which I think perfectly sums up time travel in Harry Potter. And because I don't think I could really tell it better than this, I'm just going to summarize what this post says. The link to it, by the way, will be in the description if you want to read it yourself. So, in essence, Harry Potter exists in a universe which applies the single timeline theory of time travel. Remember that, a single timeline, because that is a focal point of time travel in Harry Potter. You cannot change anything that has not already occurred. You experience a single timeline that reveals itself unchanging. There is no timeline where Buckbeak dies. There is no timeline where Sirius Black does not escape from Azkaban. There is simply what will happen and nothing else. This does call into question something else though, but before we get to that, let me remind you of time turners. Time turners are essentially what power time travel in the world of Harry Potter. Without these devices, time travel is unattainable. You just cannot learn the skill by becoming all powerful like Voldemort. And we see time turners used most famously in The Prisoner of Azkaban, of course, where Hermione, who wanted to take more classes than physically possible, was granted one by Professor McGonagall, who also actually gave one to Percy during his owls, so that Hermione can take more classes. And there's this very interesting dilemma in The Prisoner of Azkaban which made me want to make this video and really had me questioning time travel in the first place. There's a scene about halfway through the book where Harry and Ron went through one of their classes, divination I believe it was, but Hermione was not there. Of course, puzzled by this, as soon as lesson is over and slightly concerned, they rush back to Gryffindor Tower to check on her, where they find Hermione knocked out cold. Most likely from all the stress she is putting herself under with the extra classes, causing major sleep deprivation, which is why she's just completely asleep in the scene. But when Ron and Harry wake her up, long story short, she goes into a frenzy, thinking about how she needs to get to that lesson in some way. So my question was, what if she decides to use the time turner in this moment, say in her dormitory, so she can go back in time and complete that lesson since she forgot? But then that goes into question the entire single line theory. If she goes back in time now, what about this current timeline where Harry and Ron woke her up? Would it cease to exist? But then that makes no sense, because if she did decide to go back in time afterwards to catch up on the class, Harry and Ron would have seen her inside the lesson, resulting in them not rushing back to Gryffindor Tower and waking her up. So what would happen to that entire timeline? It creates a really confusing paradox. But luckily enough, that same Reddit post I mentioned earlier has given a real world example to explain this whole debacle. So in theory, let me give you an example. I left my key at a friend's house, then remembered I needed them in that moment. I would plan on going back in time to get them. And in that moment that I do plan on going back in time, I would instantly have proof of whether I had, because my keys would appear on the countertop. I would then have to go back into time, go to my friend's house, pick up my keys, and put them on my countertop. Then travel back to the present day. There is no timeline. My keys are not on the counter because all things happen in the same timeline. That is hugely important. By the way, shout out to user Cranberry44, Cranberry94. This is some really good stuff from this Reddit post. So in a nutshell, what this is suggesting, how it primarily functions in Harry Potter, is that you can only go back in time and change something if you know that it was changed, if you know that it is going to happen, hence the single timeline theory. So with Dumbledore in Prisoner of Azkaban, he was the person who suggested to Harry and Hermione to use the time turner, but he was only able to do so because Dumbledore knows. Dumbledore knows this is extremely important, that it can happen. When Buckbeak isn't killed because he escapes, Dumbledore knows that it's because of the time travelling, showing just how great his mind is, to be honest. And so it allows him to tell Harry and Hermione to go back in time later. I think that makes more sense. If not, I really don't know how else to explain it. A couple of things then, although on the time turner, because the time turner is a confusing object and the logic of it can be mind numbing at the best of times. Firstly, we have the case that Hermione mentions when travelling back in time with Harry, where wizards or witch wizards who have gone back in time have seen their past selves and gone mad, even killed each other, which then really confused me because then the question arises from this as well. What then? What if you killed your past self? What if you killed your future self? Well, let's say that you went back in time right now and killed your past self from, say, a week ago. Well, what happens then? This explanation, or rather theory, I came up with myself, and I'm honestly not sure how much sense it makes, so bear with me, and feel free to comment on it in the comments if you agree or disagree with it. So, if you went back in time and killed your past self, then the rules that I've just laid out would have been broken, and this is where things get blurry. Your future self, who went a week back into the past, remember, cannot move back forward after moving back. They move along with time until they are back at the present time at which the time they have travelled. Does that make sense? Let me just repeat that. So they move along with time when they've gone back until they go back a week later, at which they have the time that they time traveled. So if you moved back a week, you would be stuck for a week in the past, living your life again, reliving that past week again until it's back at the point at which you time traveled. So you kill your past self, now you become the new you. It creates a weird paradox where your past self died, but you now have replaced them. As long as other people don't see this, this works pretty much, I can imagine, because you just become the new you. Because everything that has happened has already happened as per the single timeline theory. Your past self would have always been replaced by your future self, who would become the new you. If other people see the death, however, then God knows what happens. All I can say is that all hell will probably break loose in the timeline. Then, if your past self kills your future self who time traveled back, the same applies, where the past becomes the new you moving forward. This part is a bit more flimsy on my side because then when you get back to it, it's confusing. But that is my theory on it, and feel free to tell me yours in the comments, by the way. I'd love to read them. Then, another confusing thing with time turners. One turn of the time turner means 1 hour. So if you did 10 turns, you would go back 10 hours. This is why I suggested you go back 1 week for the theory I just gave, because any further, and not only would you just be stood there turning the time turner over and over and over and over again for a very long time, you would also move back in time the amount of turns you gave, and you would have to relive all of that. This again creates a whole new level of confusion, but the best way of describing it is, if you move back in time a year in the Harry Potter universe, you would have to relive that entire year all over again. You don't have an option of moving back forward until you get back to that time by reliving the entire year. Although, actually, that I'm not entirely sure about how moving forward in time works with Harry Potter, but back to the point. Your future self would have to relive that entire year, avoiding your past self at all costs and not messing everything up. And they would be much older by the time they return to the present. So, in layman's terms, the past is already the past. It cannot be altered. Harry Potter adheres to a single timeline theory, where there is one single outcome to every event. Go back in time, that doesn't change that. Even if a whole debate of paradoxes can be called into question if you do meet your past self. So yeah, it's confusing, and to anyone who managed to stay all the way until the end of the video, and more so, managed to actually keep along with everything that I've said, which I don't fully understand either, then a huge well done for that. You know, it is definitely difficult, and I wouldn't be surprised if anyone watching this is watching it in 0.5 playback. But yeah, that is the best way that I would describe it. Harry Potter has a single timeline theory in the Harry Potter universe. There is only one single outcome to every single event. And let me give you one last example. When the trio is running over the hill, they hear the axe of the executioner coming down, thinking that he has killed Buckbeak. But of course, we know that when Harry and Hermione go back in time, the executioner has not killed Buckbeak. Buckbeak has already disappeared, and he's just sliced a pumpkin, I guess. So it just shows that there was never ever a single timeline, a single point in time where Buckbeak died. That just never happened. And that is how it works with Harry Potter. There is one outcome, one timeline, one thing happens consistently forever. But yeah, that is finally the end of the video. Thanks so much for watching. If you did stay till the end, make sure to subscribe. We're a growing channel and it would be hugely helpful. But that is all for today. Darth Sauron, out.